Hey, I'm Lana from Lana Glowshot Art, and in this video, we'll be unboxing the December 2024 Sketchbox. This box is all about playful mark making and brushwork. Ready? Let's go. The service in this month's box is the Sugarcane Watercolor Paper by Hanamule. This cold press watercolor paper is acid-free and is great for a variety of wet-on-wet techniques. We also have the Copic Multiliner in olive. The 0.3mm nib is great for detail work and offers precision to a playful watercolor approach. It also is waterproof, so it can be used before and after a watercolor sketch, and you don't have to worry about these lines moving at all. The prompt for this month is wreath. Let's warm up by drawing a few different things that we might see in a holiday wreath step by step. I'm starting out with some holly berries and holly leaves. For the berries, these are simple clusters of circles, and then as you move to the leaves, create sharp, jagged edges by drawing a scalloped or a convex edge around the leaf. You can play around with these as standalone objects or on a branch. The easiest way to draw a pine cone is creating several arching lines that build in quantity as you come towards the fattest part of the pine cone. Anytime you want a darker or a more bold line, you can double up on your lines and add a little bit more weight to them with your multiliner. Finish the shape off with a stem at the bottom and you're done. Another approach for drawing a pine cone is to start with more of a teardrop shape and then to open up these shapes as you move towards the base. For mistletoe, you'll start with branches and then add on some very soft, curved, simple leaves. Throw in a few berries and you're done. You can play around with the idea of drawing these as a bunch hanging upside down, or you can draw them as single sprigs and weave them into your final wreath design. Fir tree branches are a great way to add some texture to your doodles. Simply begin with one line. It can be curved or straight, and then fill in both sides of the line with tons of little pine needles. Next, we'll draw star anise. This begins almost like a flower with several petals coming out of the center and ending in points. You can come through each of these petals and add a small internal outline to create the star anise texture. You can also start with this same framework and add a couple of circles inside each of the inner outlines. Orange slices can be really festive as well. My main tip for this is don't outline everything with the exact same weight. That means vary the thickness or the thinness or even break the lines occasionally so that you have a little bit more interest within this relatively simple shape. Next, we'll draw some cinnamon. You want to imagine how the cinnamon stick is swirling in on itself. And I find that one of the easiest ways to do this is to draw a spiral and then connect it down into a long cylinder. Jingle bells, snowflakes, and fun little flourishes can also be great elements to add to your drawing. We also have 3 Cotman watercolor paint pans by Winsor & Newton in light red, Hooker's Green Dark, and Iridescent Black, and the Winsor & Newton Cotman round watercolor brush size 4. This brush creates a variety of beautiful marks that we'll use to create our florals. Our light red and our Hooker's Green Dark are very bright, vibrant shades when used on their own. However, when you combine these colors together, you can create a variety of different nuanced colors. Adding just a touch of light red to the Hooker's Green Dark will create a more subtle green, and the same goes for a little bit of green into the red. You can use the Iridescent Black to neutralize your colors, add more value, and to add a little bit of shimmer. We'll warm up with our watercolors by painting a few florals that we can incorporate into our wreaths. For a rose, I begin with several dots in the center, and then I create sweeping petals with a swooping brushstroke around the outside of these dots. As I move out from the center, I add more water to my petals, and I also add more pressure to my brush. I'll practice this again a couple more times, but this time I'll use a combination of light red and iridescent black to create a deeper, richer red. Here is a poinsettia flower with pointed petals. I'm working around the center of the flower, trying to create pointed petals with as few brush strokes as possible. A super important concept to keep in mind with this kind of floral approach is to allow the imperfections to shine through and to not get caught up in the trap of overworking your florals and leaves. For this flower, I actually start with a few dots in the center, then I load my brush up with water and I pull a petal out of each of these drops of paint. This is an even more loose abstract approach. As you continue to play around with different shapes for your petals, it can be a petal simply because you said and decided it would be a petal. When it comes to painting branches and leaves, being able to hold a really thin, fine line is key. You're going to do this by applying just the slightest bit of pressure and dragging the tip of the paintbrush across your paper. Then, for the leaves, see if you can do this in 2 strokes. Swoop, swoop. Using a combination of Hooker's Green Dark and Iridescent Black, I've created a cooler green that is going to be perfect for the fir tree branches. I begin just like I did with my multi-liner with a thin line in the center, and then I pull the needles off in either direction. Thin, fine lines can also be used as branches and can connect different elements of your wreath together. Continue to practice those thin, controlled lines so that you can make your wreath look exactly the way you want it to. A playful wet-on-wet approach can also be great for creating flowers. Here, I'm using mostly water, but there is just the tiniest bit of green in it. And then I drop really wet paint right into the water I've applied onto the paper. The water and paint mix around and give you some really unexpected results. This can be great for creating flowers like lavender or lupine. For the first wreath that we're going to create together, I want this to be really responsive. So we're going to begin with a wet-on-wet approach. Drop a ton of water in a wreath shape onto your paper. Then pick up a lot of wet paint on your brush and drop it right in. Be sure to use all of your colors and even combinations of your colors as you apply the paint. And then just step back and see what happens. Another fun thing to do with a wet-on-wet approach is to sprinkle a bit of paint onto the paper. Let your wet-on-wet painting dry completely, and this can take a while because your sugarcane watercolor paper is highly absorbent and holds a ton of water. Then with my multi-liner, I come back in anywhere that I feel like it, and I'm adding some of those elements that we practiced drawing earlier. I've added some branches with leaves. I can add in some fir branches, some pine cones, some hollyberry leaves. This is your opportunity to play and explore and be super intuitive with your approach. Because your multi-liner is waterproof, you can use it before you add paint or after you add paint. So whenever you feel ready, jump into your watercolors and begin adding floral elements in. These floral elements can be a response to some of the unexpected shapes that develop in the wet-on-wet underpainting. They can also be elements that you would like to practice a little bit more before you move into more complicated and planned pieces. As you begin to build up your wreath intuitively, play around with design concepts including balance, repetition, and pattern. It might be fun to draw several roses, but varying them slightly in size, color, even orientation. You might also consider developing a focal point in your wreath. For our final wreath together, we're going to zoom into just a corner, and I'm going to start by showing you how to paint a pine cone. First, we need a brown, so we're going to mix up a combination of our light red and our Hooker's Green Dark. To get started, you're going to begin with single strokes that start with that stroke up at the top and then begin to fan out and open up. This is similar to how we drew the shapes in our organic pine cone with our multi-liner. Don't worry about this being perfect. We can always come in and tweak and adjust it with more layers later on. Once my shape was relatively established, I created a darker version of this brown with a little bit of iridescent black and a bit less water. And then I dropped this darker color into the inner part of each of these prongs that come out of the pine cone. This is going to help add a little bit more depth. And doing this when it's wet allows the paint to move around and mix together a little bit more organically. Paint a few more pine cones into your wreath in a variety of sizes, different shapes, and orientations and colors. You can create different browns simply by adding more light red, more Hooker's Green Dark, or more iridescent black. While those pine cones are drying, I decided to come in and create berries all throughout the wreath. These berries are relatively simple, so don't overthink it. A couple swooping lines to create that circle, but then leave a little space for a highlight. I did most of the berries in light red, but to create more variety and interest, I also created deeper versions of my red by adding some iridescent black or even some Hooker's Green Dark. Creating berries in a variety of sizes and having different numbers in my clusters of berries also helps me to add more variety and interest to this piece. I built this particular wreath up in multiple layers, and I switched back and forth between my multi-liner and my watercolor several times. At this point, I wanted to add more structure to my wreath and get a feel for the organization and shape of the wreath. So I switched over to my multi-liner and I began to add branches, utilizing a bunch of the different branches and elements that we practiced earlier. This allowed me to really see how the wreath was all going to come together, and this approach could be great if you feel more confident with drawing than with painting. Now that I have a pretty good sense of the structure of the wreath and what elements are going to be where, it's time to come back in with watercolors and to fill in some of those negative spaces. I'm doing this predominantly with my green right now. I start with a really light version of Hooker's Green Dark by adding tons of water, and I begin to fill in some of those negative spaces with elements that resemble leaves. I also played around with some of the fir branch texture, and for those I often added a little bit of iridescent black so that the green would appear cooler. I jumped around throughout the wreath, filling in some of my leaves, adding in some background texture, playing around with different elements until I had more or less the entire background of the wreath completed. Now that this first layer is established with both the multi-liner and the watercolor, I can come in and begin filling in the negative spaces, refining details, and getting it to be exactly the way I want. For this final pass, I'm usually using the multi-liner to make the weight of certain lines heavier, or to add in some elements to fill in the negative spaces so that the entire drawing feels more cohesive. This is a lot about responding to what I see and being a little bit intuitive with what I feel the drawing needs. For the pine cone, I decided that I wanted the light to catch these prongs of the pine cone a little bit more. So I actually came in with some water and a paper towel and pulled some of the pigment off. This doesn't necessarily take your paper all the way back to white, but it can be a great approach for lightening some areas a little bit more and adding some more contrast or some more detail to an area that might have gotten away from you. And now this piece is complete. I hope you learned a ton about working playfully with watercolor, and we can't wait to see what you create. So be sure to use the hashtag SketchboxDecember when you post your work online. For more unboxing videos and tutorials, you can check out our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.